Hello, I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to your Essential Business Briefing. Coming up, the biggest shock in 3 decades for the oil industry. What does the attack on Saudi Arabian facilities mean for global supplies and consumers? As Google agrees a massive tax settlement with the French government, we're asking if we should be charging big tech companies for using our data. And a special report from Argentina on how the economic crisis is leaving many people hungry. First, though, it was an attack that rocked the oil markets. 5% of the world's production was affected by strikes on a crude processing facility and oil field in Saudi Arabia. Within days, the kingdom said it had already restored more than half of the supply coming from that plant. But the attack highlighted just how vulnerable parts of the world's oil supply could be. So how important is Saudi Arabia's oil in a global context, and what does it mean for us as consumers? Kate Moody's been looking into this. Kate.
Well, Stephen, by most measures, Saudi Arabia is the largest exporter of oil in the world, pumping 10% of global supplies. Data from the International Energy Agency predict its average output for 2019 will top 9 million barrels per day. It's followed closely by Russia and the United States. The latter, shown here in blue, has seen its domestic production explode thanks to shale, and it's expected to overtake the market leaders in overall exports in the coming years. Most countries keep huge reserves of oil in case of a crisis. The U.S. has the biggest backup supply. Its Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds 645 million barrels. Since being created in the 1970s, it's only been used a few times: during the first Gulf War, after Hurricane Katrina, and during the political upheaval in Libya. Donald Trump also authorized its use after the Saudi drone attacks, while Riyadh has dipped into its stash to maintain its level of exports. Members of the International Energy Agency hold about 1.4 billion barrels in total. Releasing those emergency supplies is an effort to maintain global supply and prevent prices from rising too much. When crude oil is shipped from, for example, Saudi Arabia to France, it takes about 2 months to arrive, be refined into petrol, and make it to consumers. Higher prices on global markets do tend to trickle down and lead to higher fuel costs. Freight rates are the first to be affected as the price of air cargo becomes drastically more expensive. That adds up for businesses that rely on shipping or transport of their goods. Commercial airlines also pay more for fuel, as do consumers eventually. The actual cost at the pump isn't just linked to market prices, as it also includes refining, distribution, and taxes. So a stretch of higher prices can take up to a month to be felt. Stephen?
Kate, thank you very much for that. Now, tech companies are facing increasing pressure from governments around the world to pay more tax. Most recently, Google agreed to pay the French government almost €1 billion to settle a 4-year-long tax dispute. And Apple has gone to court to fight an EU decision that it should pay Ireland €13 billion in back taxes. The French budget minister hailed the Google settlement as a landmark deal.
It's a historic victory because it marks a new era. We have settled our dispute with Google. We have also gotten nearly the entire sum that we've been asking from the company for years.
Well, as tax authorities around the world look for ways to better calculate taxation for tech companies, a French think tank is calling for an overhaul of their business model, including attaching a price to our personal data. Lucas Léger from Génération Libre is here with us in studio. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming
in. You're calling in this paper for the creation of a data market. How would that work?
Well, a data market would work basically that you would have to have attached a price to the data, to each data you transfer or each data you have, and each interaction you have with like a platform, like webmail or social media. How it would work basically is like you have a price system, so then you have an information on your data and you can value the service. And then you can, if you can value the service as a consumer, as a user, you can basically choose and increase competition among platforms. Because what we noticed in this report, and we can go back to that a bit later, is that competition the market tends to be monopolistic, meaning that you have like one big player taking all the benefits, and they're growing and growing, and they have more and more market power. That means that they can force like
people to sign unreasonable conditions or...
yeah, sign conditions, but not only that, on the other side of the market, they can also set the prices for the publicity, for the advertisement they have, and their revenues, and then they have more power to set the prices everywhere.
So would this mean that companies would end up paying us for our data? Or is this an exchange, that we use the services in exchange for our data and it feels more like a transaction?
That would be up to you, basically, because if you want to protect your privacy and then, no, I don't want my data to be sold to those platforms, then I would pay for the service, obviously. On the other hand, if you are willing to share your data and not willing to pay for those services, you can do it, and you can pay with your data as it is today. So you keep with the status quo, basically.
Will that make the system more complicated for users, though? Do you think that people will really invest in, that sort of transaction rather than the current system, which involves relatively little engagement from people, at least on a regular basis?
We noticed that there is a great paradox that economists call the privacy paradox in this market. Basically, people are willing to protect their data and their privacy, but their behavior online shows completely different, because of course the service is apparently free. So they agree to go on the platform and share their data, but they're not really careful on how they behave. So with the price and with data ownership, you can do arbitrage, and you can really say, okay, yeah, I want to protect my data, or no, the price I get in exchange is not really worth it, so I'm willing to pay with my data.
But would big tech companies, the Googles or Facebooks of this world, would they survive if there was a market for data?
Well, you can have the market would be, of course, the business model would be a bit different, and the market would slightly transform. What we think is that it's going to be more intermediaries taking care of the data and the contracts, but they could still survive because they can set up the price of the service to compensate the losses they have for advertisement, for instance. But it's true that so far the behavior online does not suggest that people are really willing to engage, but they are not willing to engage because they lack the information, and that's what we want to try to say in this work with Génération Libre, is that we lack information, and lacking information makes your choice contradictory.
So how would you envisage this working if it were to be implemented? Is this going to be a new GDPR, those new EU data rules that came into force last year?
Well, no, we're not really in favor of piling up regulations as it is today in the EU, because it's most of the time it's just choke innovation. What we want to do is by creating a market, you're creating more competition among platforms. So the GDPR has some good points. One of them is that it allows users to transfer their data from one service provider to another. It's called portability. Mm-hmm. That's the first step to data ownership. But the second step is having a full market.
Have you, since this paper was published, had any feedback from tech companies about this?
We do have some feedbacks where, but yeah. Are
there any companies in favor?
Some of them, yes, because you have startup trying to set up those kind of contracts now. It's an emerging market. Especially
any of the big names?
No, the big names are more we should. They agree on the fact that the behavior is contradictory, as I said in the beginning, and they agree that something should be done. They're more into giving more control to the users than having a full market. But this is to be discussed, and that's what we are trying to do with this report.
Okay, and we'll follow that idea with you. Lucas Léger from Génération Libre, thank you very much for coming in to speak to us.
Thank you.
Now, a new law on emergency food aid is aiming to bring help to some of those worst affected by Argentina's economic crisis. As inflation runs at more than 50%, it's estimated that 5 million more people have fallen below the poverty line in 2019. Almost a third of them are suffering from malnutrition. Our correspondents in Buenos Aires sent us this report.
In this typical working-class neighbourhood in Buenos Aires, many students go to school hungry. They come from poor families devastated by the crisis. The food given at school can be a lifeline.
At home, they don't have a proper dinner, usually just a broth or herbal tea.
But the rations provided by the government have been getting smaller, and they provide almost no meat.
We aren't receiving bread or snacks like before, which used to be a small sandwich, a cereal bar and fruit. Right when we need it the most. Children would take that food home for their dinners.
The price of bread has tripled in 2 years. Many people have cut back, whilst others can't buy any at all. Faced with this, more and more bakeries are giving away their unsold goods.
Desayuno, almuerzo, merienda y cena.
Breakfast, lunch, snacks and supper, those are long gone. Breakfast is the only decent meal I eat, thanks to the bread I get from here.
Porque llevamos pan de acá.
More and more people find themselves waiting in the cold as the queue gets longer each week.
Nobody here lives on the streets. We have a place to stay, but we're not able to feed ourselves, to get enough money to buy food from the store.
So Argentines protest almost daily, demanding government action, jobs and a way to feed themselves. Charities occupy the plaza in front of the presidential palace.
People can only get food at soup kitchens now. Everything has fallen on the backs of charities. The demand is growing and it's getting harder for us to respond to the level of hunger in the nation.
A new food emergency bill would see a 50% increase in funding for support given to the country's most vulnerable, including children and the elderly.
Well, that's it from us for this week. But as always, you'll find the best of our business coverage on our website, on our Facebook page, France 24 Business, and you can tweet me with your comments at NewStephen. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Here at France 24, we're taking a broad outlook by talking about the women who are reshaping our world.
En France 24 en español no tenemos temas vedados. Y eso se puede ver en televisión y en todas las plataformas que tenemos en Internet.
في فرانس 24 لا ننسى ونحجز لكم أسبوعياً تذكرة عودة للمدن والمناطق التي كانت في قلب الأحداث قبل أن تدخل في طي النسيان.
Claro que tiene algo especial. Somos todos de distintos países y trabajamos con todo el corazón para entregar información en el momento preciso.
أخبار سياسية واقتصادية وثقافية وأيضاً رياضية بأعين خبراء رياضيين. هذه هي قناة فرانس 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.